The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Riverside University's most exclusive coffee shop, creating a cozy atmosphere that perfectly matched the warm scent of freshly ground beans and expensive pastries. Students clustered around small tables, their designer bags, and latest gadgets, marking them as members of the elite circles that dominated this prestigious institution. Natasha Rivers stood behind the polished counter, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup, as she carefully crafted yet another complicated order. Her paint-stained apron covered a simple sweater that had seen better days, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that kept it away from her tired eyes. She had been working double shifts at the campus coffee shop for 3 months now. Ever since her scholarship funding had been cut due to budget restrictions, the morning rush was particularly brutal today, with entitled students demanding perfection in their overpriced drinks while barely acknowledging her existence. Natasha had learned to smile through their dismissive attitudes, knowing that every tip brought her closer to paying for her art supplies and keeping her dream of becoming a professional artist alive. The bell above the door chimed. She looked up to see a group that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. Damian Cross walked in with his usual entourage of wealthy friends, their expensive clothes and confident swagger marking them as campus royalty. Damian himself was undeniably handsome, with sharp features and piercing green eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with calculating precision. His family owned half the businesses in the city, and his presence at Riverside was more about maintaining tradition than actually needing an education. Natasha had been unfortunate enough to share an economics class with Damian during her first year, where she had witnessed his casual cruelty toward students he deemed beneath his social status. He had a particular talent for cutting remarks delivered with a charming smile that made them even more devastating. She had managed to avoid him since then, but working at the coffee shop made such encounters inevitable. The group approached the counter with the kind of casual arrogance that came from never having to worry about money or consequences. Damian's friend Trevor was in the middle of telling a story about his latest expensive purchase. While another friend laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't particularly funny, they moved through the space as if they owned it, which in many ways they did. "I'll have my usual," Damian said, without looking up from his phone, his voice carrying the expectation of being immediately understood and accommodated. His usual was a complex drink that required multiple steps and expensive ingredients, the kind of order that took twice as long to make as anything else on the menu. Natasha began preparing the drink with practiced efficiency, her movements quick and precise. Despite the pressure she felt under the group's casual scrutiny, she could hear them discussing their weekend plans, talking about ski trips and yacht parties with the same tone others might use to discuss grocery shopping. Their world was so far removed from her own reality that it felt like listening to characters in a movie. As she worked, Natasha became aware that their conversation had shifted. Trevor was making cruel comments about scholarship students, his voice loud enough for half the coffee shop to hear. He talked about how these students didn't really belong at Riverside, how they brought down the overall quality of the institution with their desperate attempts to fit in. Look around," Trevor continued, his gesture encompassing the coffee shop. "Half these people are probably working to pay for textbooks while we're planning spring break in the Maldives. It's just sad, really." Natasha's hands tightened around the cup she was holding, but she continued working. She had heard worse comments before and had learned that reacting only made things more difficult. The best strategy was to finish their orders quickly and hope they would leave without causing more trouble. But today was different. Today, her exhaustion from working 2 jobs while maintaining her grades had worn down her usual defenses. Today, the stress of wondering how she would afford next semester's tuition had left her feeling raw and vulnerable. When Trevor made another particularly cruel comment about students who couldn't even afford proper clothes, something inside her snapped. "Maybe those students are working twice as hard as anyone else here," she said quietly, not looking up from the espresso machine. Maybe they actually appreciate the opportunity instead of treating it like a given right. The group fell silent, and Natasha immediately regretted speaking. Gosh, she knew better than to engage with customers, especially these customers. Her manager had made it clear that her job depended on maintaining a friendly, accommodating attitude. No matter what, Damien looked up from his phone for the first time, his green eyes focusing on her with sudden interest. There was something unreadable in his expression as he took in her defiant posture and the flush of anger on her cheeks. For a moment, the coffee shop felt completely silent despite the usual bustle of morning customers. "Excuse me?" Trevor said, his voice sharp with indignation. "Did the help just give us a lecture about appreciation?" Natasha's face burned with embarrassment, but she had gone too far to back down now. "I'm just saying that maybe people should think before they make assumptions about others. Not everyone here has the same advantages." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and Natasha became aware that other customers had begun to notice the confrontation. Some were pretending not to listen, while others watched with open curiosity, eager for drama to break up their mundane morning routines. Damien stepped closer to the counter, his expression still unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried easily through the suddenly hushed space. "You're absolutely right," he said, and Natasha felt a moment of surprise and relief. Not everyone has the same advantages. But then his expression changed, becoming cold and calculating. Some people have to work in coffee shops and lecture paying customers about their attitudes. Some people can't afford to mind their own business because they're too busy being bitter about what they don't have. The words hit Natasha like a physical blow, made worse by the laughter that erupted from his friends. Other customers began to whisper among themselves, some looking at her with pity, while others seemed to enjoy the spectacle. She felt exposed and humiliated in a way that went beyond simple embarrassment. "That's enough," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as she tried to maintain some dignity in the face of his cruelty. But Damien wasn't finished. He seemed to feed off the attention from his friends and the growing audience of onlookers. "I'm sure your art degree will be very useful when you're still making coffee in 10 years, assuming you can even afford to finish it." The final blow came when he pulled out his wallet and threw a $20 bill on the counter with deliberate casualness. "Keep the change," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you need it more than I do." Natasha stared at the money, feeling the weight of every eye in the coffee shop on her. The humiliation was complete and devastating, made worse by the fact that she did need the money, desperately. Her pride warred with her practical needs as she stood frozen behind the counter. Unable to move or speak, Damien picked up his drink and turned to leave with his friends, their laughter echoing through the space as they made their exit. Other customers gradually returned to their conversations, but Natasha could feel their sideways glances and whispered comments. She had become the morning's entertainment, a cautionary tale about knowing one's place. For the rest of her shift, Natasha moved through her duties mechanically, her mind replaying the confrontation over and over. Each time she remembered Damien's cold smile or his friend's laughter, the humiliation burned fresh and hot. She made mistakes on orders, spilled drinks, struggled to maintain the friendly facade that her job required. When her shift finally ended, she gathered her things and walked across campus to her afternoon art class, trying to lose herself in the familiar comfort of paints and canvases. But even as she worked on her latest piece, a landscape that captured the golden light of autumn afternoons, she couldn't shake the memory of those green eyes looking at her with such casual cruelty that evening. In her tiny shared dorm room, Natasha made a promise to herself. She would finish her degree, no matter how many double shifts it took. She would build a successful career in the art world, proving that talent and determination mattered more than family connections or inherited wealth. And someday, somehow, she would show Damien Cross that he had been wrong about her. She couldn't know that across campus, in his luxurious private apartment. Damien was staring out at the same autumn landscape she had been painting, feeling an unfamiliar twist of guilt in his chest. He couldn't understand why the encounter at the coffee shop bothered him so much, or why he kept thinking about the way her eyes had flashed with defiance before filling with hurt the $20 bill she had left on the counter sat on his dresser, where he had placed it after finding it in his pocket that evening. He told himself he didn't know why he had kept it, but somewhere in the depths of his conscience, he understood that it represented something he couldn't quite name, something that would haunt him long after the laughter of his friends. 10 years later, both Natasha and Damien would look back on that autumn morning as the moment that changed everything. But neither could have predicted just how dramatically their paths would cross again, or how the humiliation of a coffee shop confrontation would ultimately lead to something neither of them saw coming. The seeds of their future had been planted in cruelty and pride, but they would grow into something far more complex and beautiful than either could have imagined. The Whitmore Gallery buzzed with the sophisticated energy that only Manhattan's elite art scene could generate. Crystal champagne flutes caught the light from carefully positioned spotlights, while guest and designer evening wear moved through the space with the practiced grace of those accustomed to such events. Tonight's auction featured contemporary pieces from emerging artists, and the guest list read like a who's who of New York's cultural and financial elite. Natasha Rivers stood near the back of the gallery, observing the crowd with the trained eye of someone who had spent the last decade learning to navigate these waters. At 32, she bore little resemblance to the struggling art student who had once served coffee to entitled college students. Her dark hair was styled in an elegant updo, and her black cocktail dress was simple but perfectly tailored, chosen to convey success without ostentation. She owned 3 galleries now. It's built from nothing but determination and an unwavering belief in her ability to spot talent before anyone else recognized it. Her first gallery had been a tiny space in Brooklyn, funded by years of savings and a small business loan that had taken her 5 years to pay off. But she had an eye for emerging artists and the business sense to market them effectively, turning unknowns into sought-after names in the contemporary art world. Tonight's auction included several pieces from artists she had discovered and nurtured, and watching the bidding wars unfold filled her with a satisfaction that went beyond simple profit. She had built something meaningful, something that proved talent and hard work could triumph over privilege and connections. Natasha Rivers, a familiar voice said behind her, and she turned to find Janet Walsh, one of the city's most influential art critics. "I should have known you'd be here tonight. 3 of these artists came from your stable, didn't they?" "I prefer to think of it as providing opportunities," Natasha replied with a smile, accepting the air kisses that were standard currency in this world. "Though I can't complain about the return on investment." Janet laughed, a sound like expensive wind chimes, always modest. "I heard rumors about the Pemberton estate sale next month. Are you interested in the Monet collection?" Before Natasha could answer, a commotion near the front of the gallery caught her attention. The crowd seemed to part like water, creating a clear path for someone obviously important. She turned to see who commanded such automatic deference, and felt her breath catch in her throat. Damian Cross moved through the gallery with the same commanding presence he had possessed in college. But age had refined his arrogance into something more sophisticated, and therefore more dangerous. His tailored tuxedo fit him perfectly, emphasizing broad shoulders and a lean frame that suggested he still made time for physical fitness, despite his demanding schedule. His hair was shorter now, with just a touch of silver at the temples that only made him more distinguished, but it was his eyes that stopped her cold. Those same piercing green eyes that had looked at her with such casual cruelty 10 years ago now swept the room with the confidence of a man who owned whatever space he entered. He was accompanied by an entourage of assistants and advisors, their movements coordinated, round his preferences like planets orbiting a sun. Natasha felt her carefully cultivated composure threaten to crack. She had known this moment would come eventually. New York's elite circles were smaller than they appeared, and success in any field eventually led to intersections with people from your past. She had even prepared for it, practicing casual greetings and professional small talk in case their paths crossed at events like this. But seeing him in person, watching the way other guests gravitated toward him with obvious reverence, brought back every moment of humiliation from that autumn morning. The memory of his cruel words and cold smile crashed over her like a wave, threatening to drag her back to the person she had been when she was powerless and vulnerable. "Who is that?" she asked Janet, proud that her voice remained steady despite the chaos in her chest. "Damian Cross," Janet replied, lowering her voice with the reverence reserved for true power. "Cross Industries just acquired half the galleries in Soho. Word is he's looking to expand into contemporary art, maybe start his own auction house. The man has the Midas touch when it comes to business." Natasha nodded, filing away this information while struggling to process the implications. If Damien was expanding into her world, their paths wouldn't just cross occasionally at social events. They would be competing in the same market, potentially for the same artists and collectors, as if summoned by her thoughts. Damien's gaze swept across the room and landed on her. For a moment that felt like an eternity, their eyes met across the crowded gallery. She saw recognition flicker in his expression, followed by something she couldn't quite identify, surprise perhaps, or calculation. Then his attention was claimed by someone else, and the moment passed. But the damage was done. Natasha felt exposed and off balance in a way she hadn't experienced in years. She had built her confidence carefully, piece by piece, through every success and conquered challenge. Yet one look from Damien Cross had shaken foundations she thought were unbreakable. "Excuse me," she murmured to Janet, needing space to collect herself. She made her way toward the gallery's private office, hoping to find a quiet moment to regain her composure before the main auction began. The office was small but elegant, lined with catalogs and art books that represented decades of accumulated expertise. Natasha closed the door behind her and leaned against it, allowing herself a moment of honest reaction to seeing the man who had haunted her nightmares for years. She had imagined this meeting countless times, always picturing herself as poised and successful, able to face him as an equal rather than the desperate student she had once been. In her fantasies, he would be the one caught off guard, perhaps even ashamed of his past behavior. She would be gracious but distant, proving through her success that his cruel predictions had been wrong. Instead, she felt like that 22-year-old girl again, humiliated and powerless while he commanded attention and respect from everyone around him. The realization that he still had this effect on her was almost as disturbing as the original humiliation had been. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Janet or another colleague checking on her absence from the main event. Instead, Damien Cross stepped into the office, closing the door behind him with quiet authority. In the small space, his presence felt overwhelming, filling every corner with the force of his personality. Up close, she could see the subtle signs of maturity that 10 years had brought, lines around his eyes that spoke of late nights and difficult decisions, a gravity in his expression that suggested the weight of real responsibility. "Hello, Natasha," he said, his voice exactly as she remembered it, but somehow deeper, more resonant. "It's been a long time." She straightened, drawing on every lesson she had learned about projecting confidence in challenging situations. "Damien, I heard you were expanding into the art world. How interesting." He moved closer, and she caught the scent of expensive cologne, mixed with something distinctly masculine that made her traitorous pulse quicken. "I've been following your career," he said, the admission surprising them both. 3 galleries, a reputation for discovering talent, featured in Art Forum twice this year. Impressive. The compliment felt like a trap, though she couldn't identify the specific danger. "Thank you. I've worked hard for what I've built." Something flickered in his expression, a shadow of what might have been regret. "I'm sure you have. You always struck me as someone who wouldn't give up easily." The reference to their shared past hung between them like a challenge. Natasha felt her carefully maintained professional facade beginning to crack under the pressure of unresolved emotions. "Is there something specific you wanted to discuss, or are you just making social rounds?" Damien smiled, but it wasn't the cold, calculating expression she remembered from college. This smile seemed almost rueful, touched with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "Actually, there is something. I have a proposition for you." "I'm not interested in selling," she said quickly, assuming he was here to make an acquisition offer. It wouldn't be the first time a larger company had tried to buy out her business, but none had sent their CEO to make the approach personally. "Not looking to buy," he replied, moving to the window that overlooked the gallery's main floor. "I'm looking to collaborate." The word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications she wasn't prepared to consider. "Collaborate how?" Cross Industries is launching a new initiative focused on emerging contemporary artists. Want to create opportunities for talent that might otherwise be overlooked by the traditional gallery system. He turned back to face her, his expression serious. Your reputation for discovering and nurturing new artists is exactly what we need. Natasha stared at him, trying to process this unexpected development. You want me to work with you? I want your expertise, your eye for talent, your connections with artists who haven't been discovered yet. In return, I can offer resources you've never had access to. Unlimited budget for acquisitions. Marketing support that could put your artists in major museums, international exposure that takes most galleries decades to achieve. The offer was tempting in ways that went beyond simple business opportunity. The resources he described could transform not just her galleries, but the careers of dozens of artists she believed in. It was everything she had worked toward handed to her on a silver platter, but it was also a deal with the devil who had humiliated her when she was most vulnerable. Working with Damien would mean seeing him regularly, trusting him with something. She had built from nothing, making herself dependent on his resources and goodwill. Why me? She asked, genuinely puzzled. There are gallery owners with more experience, bigger reputations, established relationships with the kind of collectors you're trying to reach. Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the window. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. Because I know what it's like to be underestimated. I know you won't let success make you forget where you came from. The answer surprised her with its apparent sincerity, but it also raised more questions than it answered. This is quite a change from the person I knew in college. People change, he said simply. 10 years is a long time. Not everyone changes, she replied, thinking of Trevor and the other friends who had laughed at her humiliation. Some people just get better at hiding who they really are. Damien stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his green eyes. You're right to be suspicious. I haven't given you any reason to trust me, but I'm hoping you'll consider the opportunity on its own merits. He pulled a business card from his jacket and placed it on the desk between them. Think about it. The offer is genuine, and there are no strings attached. If you decide you're interested, call me. If not, I'll understand. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. For what it's worth, Natasha, I was wrong about you. Completely wrong. I hope you've built something that proves that every day. Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the scent of his cologne and a business card that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Through the window, she could see him rejoining his entourage, seamlessly sliding back into his role as the commanding businessman who controlled rooms with his presence. But she had seen something else in those few minutes. Vulnerability that she wasn't sure he had intended to reveal. The man who had made that offer wasn't the same person who had humiliated her in a coffee shop 10 years ago. Maybe he was. And she was seeing what she wanted to see because the opportunity he presented was everything she had ever dreamed of achieving. As the auction began in the main gallery, Natasha remained in the office, staring at the business card and trying to understand how her carefully ordered world had been turned upside down in the span of a single conversation. Girl who had once served him coffee was gone, replaced by a successful businesswoman who commanded respect in her chosen field. But the man who had broken her confidence with casual cruelty had apparently become someone who recognized her achievements and wanted to help her reach even greater heights. The question was whether she could trust this new version of Damien Cross, or if she was setting herself up for a humiliation that would make their college encounter seem gentle by comparison. 3 weeks after the gallery encounter, Natasha sat in the executive conference room of Cross Industries, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of Manhattan's skyline. The room itself was a testament to understated power, with its polished marble table, leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars, an original artwork that would make any museum curator weep with envy. She had spent those 3 weeks researching everything she could find about Damien Cross and his business empire. What she discovered had surprised her. Cross Industries wasn't just another corporate giant focused solely on profit. Under Damien's leadership, the company had pioneered several charitable initiatives, funded scholarship programs for underprivileged students, and invested in community development, projects that actually benefited local residents rather than displacing them. The man described in business journals bore little resemblance to the cruel college student she remembered. Articles praised his innovative approach to corporate responsibility, his fair treatment of employees, and his commitment to sustainable business practices. Either he had undergone a complete personality transformation, or she had never really known who he was beneath the privileged exterior. "Miss Rivers," Damien said as he entered the conference room, followed by two assistants carrying thick folders. He looked every inch the successful CEO in his perfectly tailored navy suit, but she noticed he seemed more serious than usual, almost nervous. "Thank you for coming. I have to admit I'm curious about this meeting," she replied, accepting the seat he indicated.
"Your message said you had a modified proposal, but it was rather vague on details."
Damien dismissed his assistants with a subtle gesture, waiting until they were alone before speaking. "What I'm about to discuss with you is extremely confidential. I need your word that nothing we say here today will leave this room, regardless of whether you agree to participate." The gravity in his voice made her sit up straighter. "You have it." He moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the city below. "My grandfather changed his will. The new version includes a clause that requires me to be married before my 35th birthday in order to inherit control of Cross Industries." Natasha blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry, what?" "Apparently my grandfather decided that a married man would be more stable, more committed to building a lasting legacy rather than just accumulating wealth." Damien's voice carried a note of bitter amusement. "He gave me until December 15th to find a suitable wife or control of the company. Passes to my cousin Bradley." "That's only 6 months away," she said, still processing this unexpected revelation.
Exactly.
He turned back to face her, his expression unreadable.
Exactly.
"Bradley would destroy everything I've built in the name of maximizing short-term profits. The charitable initiatives, the employee programs, the community investments, all of it would disappear within a year." Natasha began to see where this conversation was heading, and the realization made her stomach flutter with anxiety. "And you want me to help you find someone suitable?" "No," he said quietly. "I want you to marry me." The words hung in the air between them like a bomb waiting to explode. Natasha felt as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room, leaving her gasping for something to say that would make sense of what she had just heard. "You can't be serious," she finally managed. "Completely serious." He returned to his seat, pulling one of the folders toward him. "It would be a business arrangement, nothing more. A marriage of convenience that serves both our interests." "How could this possibly serve my interests?" she asked, her voice rising slightly with incredulity. "Because I'm prepared to offer you something no one else can." He opened the folder and slid a document across the table. "Full ownership of the Meridian Gallery, complete funding for your emerging artist program, and a $20 million acquisition budget." Natasha stared at the papers, her mind reeling. The Meridian Gallery was the most prestigious contemporary art space in the city, owned by the same family for 3 generations. It had been her dream to work there since she was a student, but the current owners had always rejected her approaches. "They would never sell," she said weakly. "They already have. I bought it yesterday." His voice was matter-of-fact, as if purchasing world-class art galleries was something he did every Tuesday. "It's yours if you agree to this arrangement." Looked up from the papers to find him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "For how long? 2 years minimum? Long enough to satisfy my grandfather's requirements and establish the marriage as legitimate. After that, we can divorce amicably and you keep everything." The practical part of her mind was already calculating the possibilities. $20 million could fund dozens of emerging artists, launching careers that might otherwise never get off the ground. The Meridian Gallery would give her a platform to showcase work that challenged conventions and pushed boundaries. It was everything she had worked toward, offered freely, with no expectation of romantic entanglement. But the emotional part of her mind was screaming warnings. This was Damien Cross, the man who had humiliated her when she was most vulnerable. Trusting him with her business was one thing, but trusting him with her life, even temporarily, felt like stepping into a trap. "This is insane," she said, pushing the papers back toward him. "Marriage isn't a business transaction, isn't it?" challenged. "How many society marriages are really about love versus financial advantage or social position? At least we're being honest about our motivations." And what about when the press finds out? People start asking questions about our relationship history. She stood and began pacing, trying to work through the implications. This whole thing could blow up in both our faces. We'll manage the narrative carefully. A whirlwind romance between two successful professionals who discovered they had more in common than expected. He leaned back in his chair, watching her pace. It's not that unusual a story, except for the part where you publicly humiliated me in college, she pointed out sharply. For the first time since she had known him, Damien looked genuinely uncomfortable. About that, he began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair. I owe you an apology, a real one. She stopped pacing and turned to face him fully. I'm listening. I was 22 and insufferably arrogant. I thought my family's money made me better than everyone else, and I enjoyed demonstrating that power over people I saw as beneath me. His voice was quiet but steady. What I did to you is cruel and unnecessary, and I've regretted it every day since. The apology was more than she had ever expected to receive, but it also raised new questions. If you've regretted it so much, why didn't you ever try to make amends? Because I was a coward, he admitted, and because I knew nothing I could say would undo the damage I had done. I figured the best thing I could do was leave you alone to build the successful life you deserved. There was something in his tone that suggested deeper currents beneath his words. But before she could explore that thought, he continued. Look, I know this is a lot to ask. I know you have every reason to tell me to go to hell and walk out. Of here, he stood and moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. But think about what you could accomplish with those resources. Think about the artists whose careers you could launch, the boundaries. You could push the impact you could have on the entire contemporary art world. The temptation was almost overwhelming. Everything he was offering represented years of dreams and goals that she had thought would take decades to achieve, if they were possible at all. The rational part of her mind was already calculating timelines and possibilities, imagining the exhibitions she could mount and the unknowns she could transform into established names. But there was also a dangerous undercurrent to his proposal that had nothing to do with business. Standing this close to him, seeing the vulnerability beneath his confident exterior, she was forced to acknowledge an attraction that she had spent 10 years trying to deny. The college boy who had humiliated her had grown into a man who commanded attention without demanding it, who wore power like a well-tailored suit rather than wielding it like a weapon. I need time to think about this, she said, stepping back to put some distance between them. Of course, he returned to his seat, instantly professional again. But I do need an answer by the end of the week. The timeline doesn't allow for extended deliberation, and if I say no, then I'll respect your decision and find another solution to my problem. Oh. His smile was rueful. Though I can't imagine anyone else who would bring the same combination of talent, independence, and absolutely justified distrust of my motives. Despite everything, Natasha found herself smiling back. You really know how to sell a proposition. It's a gift, he said. And for a moment she glimpsed the charm that had probably gotten him through 1,000 difficult business negotiations. She gathered her purse and prepared to leave. Damien spoke again. Natasha, if it helps your decision, you should know that you're the only person I would trust with this arrangement. And not just because of your professional qualifications. She turned back to him, seeing something in his expression that made her heart skip a beat. What do you mean? Mean that you're the only person I know who can't be bought? Who won't try to turn a temporary arrangement into something permanent for personal gain? He met her eyes directly. You're the only person who already knows the worst about me and has still managed to build something incredible despite what I put you through. The compliment hit deeper than she expected, touching on insecurities she had thought were long buried. You barely know me anymore. I know enough, he said quietly. I know you've built 3 successful galleries without compromising your principles. I know you've discovered artists who are now in major museum collections. I know you've turned down acquisition offers that would have made you wealthy because you believed in maintaining your independence. The fact that he had researched her career so thoroughly was both flattering and slightly unsettling. You've been thorough. I don't enter into business arrangements blindly. Stood and moved to the door, preparing to escort her out. But for what it's worth, this stopped being purely about business. The the moment I saw you at the Whitmore Gallery." Before she could ask what he meant by that, he was opening the door and summoning his assistant to escort her to the elevator. She rode down to street level. Natasha's mind raced with possibilities and dangers in equal measure. The offer was everything she had ever wanted professionally, wrapped in a package that could either fulfill her dreams or destroy everything she had built. The man making the offer was someone she had every reason to distrust, but who had just shown her glimpses of depth and regret that suggested he might be worth the risk. By the time she reached her gallery, one thing was clear. Whatever she decided, her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict or control. The only question was whether she was brave enough to take the leap or wise enough to walk away from temptation disguised as opportunity. The ring Damien had shown her sat in its velvet box in his office safe. A 3-carat diamond, surrounded by sapphires, that would mark her as his wife in the eyes of the world, whether it would represent the beginning of her greatest triumph or her most devastating mistake remained to be seen. But as she looked around her current gallery, calculating what she could accomplish with unlimited resources and the most prestigious venue in the city, Natasha began to suspect that she had already made her decision. The only question now was whether she was brave enough to admit it to herself.